uh, John Chambers, and if you permit me to say, the icon of entrepreneurship, Dr. Mukesh Aghi, my dear friend Anil Agarwal, and distinguished startup participants. Let me first of all wish all of you a very happy new year. We look forward to a healthier, happier, and more productive year ahead. And we are starting the year with the startups. I have been looking forward to today's interaction for a while. I would like to thank Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion of India and compliment United States India Strategic Partnership Forum for helping us stitch together the mentoring program for Indian startups. Today is only a beginning. This is the first in series of events that are being organized by us with the support of DIPPI and USISPF. The young entrepreneurs who have joined us today are true representatives of India's aspirations. You are our dream, and you take us closer to our dream as a nation. The small solutions to big problems you offer are very significant. Your passion, inquisitiveness, and desire to make a difference makes you critical and central to India's growth story. We have seen the ingenuity of young, innovative firms during the current pandemic. Startups have helped countries in going digital in work, education, and health services, thereby bringing out their best in an extraordinary situation in which the world found itself. Every industry needs to keep pace with the changing times. With the advent of new technologies like AI, Internet of Things, blockchain, data analytics, the global IT demand is shifting from traditional requirement of software services and systems integration. New opportunities and areas of partnership are emerging in health, e-commerce, fintech, online education, smart cities, electronic manufacturing, rural and urban infrastructure, renewable energy, and mobile-enabled products and services, etc., etc. Behind all these sea changes is not just technology. It is someone who found out the best use of technology to contribute to the society, an entrepreneur who thinks differently. Friends, entrepreneur activity has picked up in India. In 2020, India was among the top 50 innovative economies. Today, India is the third largest startup ecosystem in the world and is home to 21 unicorns valued at $73.2 billion. Some estimates more than 50 unicorn startups might join the unicorn club as early as 2022. According to a recent report, Indian startups raised $9.3 billion until mid-December this year. A little below 2019, but definitely encouraging considering the current pandemic. It is because of people like you who are not averse to taking risks and were not deterred by the challenges. People like you continue to think out of the box. People like you put all your efforts in creating a better life around you. Rise of Indian IT companies, large talent pool, increased expendable income of Indian middle class, and availability of capital have contributed to the growth of India's startup ecosystem. More recently, increased usage of smartphones, access to internet, and recent reforms to push digital finance have given further impetus. There have also been a significant push from the government through initiatives like Startup India and Digital India. Indian startups are steadily evolving into global entities, creating business products and solutions for global market. The Bay Area Silicon Valley is world's topmost innovation hub, accounting for, I'm told, more than a fifth of global venture capital investment. Its success has been hard to replicate elsewhere, even with sizable investments. The important ingredient that is often found missing elsewhere is the culture of Silicon Valley, helping fellow entrepreneurs, even if competitors, without exception or returns. It is called paying it forward. I'm delighted to note that a sense of fellowship and community is slowly making its way into the Indian ecosystem as well, to inspire and handhold young founders. Three cities, Bengaluru, Mumbai, and NCR Delhi, have changed the face of modern India and find a place among the famous global startup hubs. Cities like Pune, Hyderabad, Ahmedabad, and Kolkata are counted amongst the emerging startup hubs. We need to do more to be counted amongst the superstar hubs. India and Silicon Valley have a close relationship spanning over many decades. As Mukesh mentioned, Prime Minister Modi's visit to Silicon Valley in 2015 signified the importance of entrepreneurial bridge and partnership. I was there as Deputy Ambassador then. This is a journey which we have commenced years ago. Friends, I'm delighted that the symbiotic relationship is growing steadily. Indian programmers, engineers, and entrepreneurs are providing their skills, and that too in sizable numbers, to US companies. India is also a leading R&D hub for many of these companies. US-based venture firms have been investing in the Indian talent and are amongst the largest players in the field. In fact, Silicon Valley companies and US tech-focused private equity firms have invested significantly in India's tech sector over the past several months. Bay Area Silicon Valley is also central to growth strategies of many Indian companies, bringing innovation to the doorstep of customers with the help of startups. In the US, startup ecosystem is developing beyond Silicon Valley, and big economic centers like New York, Boston, LA, Chicago, Philadelphia, the Research Triangle in North Carolina, Portland, etc., are gaining prominence as emerging startup hubs. This has opened up new opportunities for collaboration for Indian entrepreneurs. We would like to see more of these bonds. It is with this in mind that we have devised the mentorship program for Indian startups. Apart from policy, regulatory, and funding support, mentorship is vital for startups. Their experiences and knowledge, their successes and failures become invaluable inputs for the young startups to avoid pitfalls. We are bringing to you the stories of their struggles and success. Our hope is that you can benefit from their experiences in your entrepreneur journey. It was Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the United States, who said, "Diligence is the mother of good luck." May you all find more fortune in the days ahead. And God forbid, when you feel like giving up, don't forget, every company was once a startup. Thank you.
Ambassador Sandhu, thank you very much for your opening remarks and message to the startups which are on this platform at the moment listening. We do have Department of Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade Joint Secretary, Shri Anil Agarwal. I'm going to invite you to give his opening remarks. Mr. Agarwal.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mukesh. My old friend and my colleague, Ambassador Sandhu, Mr. John Chambers, Chairman of the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, Dr. Mukesh Aghi, President and CEO of US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, all my friends from the startup community, and all our torch bearers of innovation and entrepreneurship in India who have joined us today. It's an honor and a privilege to address all of you today. These are unprecedented times, and I hope you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. I wish everyone a very, very happy New Year. The Startup India initiative was launched by Honorable Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi in January 2016. He was a visionary when he launched Startup India movement. That was the time when not many people in the government of India understood what a startup was and how to support startups, how to support innovation and entrepreneurship in this journey. Over the last 5 years, we have worked towards developing capacities not only amongst Government of India officers, but also amongst all of our states and union territories. We have 36 of them. And the result has been outstanding. Today, out of these 36 states and UTs, we have startup specific policies in 29 states and union territories. We are very close to completing all of them. All of these states have specific incentives to offer to young innovators and entrepreneurs. If you look at the spread of startups in the country, we have 720 districts, and out of them, we have a startup in 580 of them, which is more than 80% of our geography is covered by at least a startup. Today, we have more than 41,000 startups registered with us. And if you look at their composition, they are classifying themselves into 47 different sectors and more than 207 subsectors. They have generated on an average 12 jobs per startup. They're mind-boggling figures. We wanted to know what is the quality of these startups. And with that in mind, we instituted the first ever National Startup Awards last year. The results have been outstanding. We divided the startups into 12 different sectors of economy. After a detailed process conducted by domain experts, independent of the government, we selected 192 startups to present before the juries. And 36 of them were adjudged the winners in different categories. And I want to point out the eligibility conditions that we had put for these startups. Everyone must have a product in the market. They are not idea state startups. Everyone has been doing a business. They must have trade specific registrations, and they must not have defaulted on their payments to anyone. So what we have is a group of young entrepreneurs who have been checked that they have been doing their businesses ethically. This is a group of people that we are now supporting. As Government of India, we are trying to support our National Startup Award finalists across 8 different sectors. The first one is the most important one, that is mentoring. We are trying to get them also to investors. We are trying to connect them to corporates. We are trying to resolve their regulatory issues. We are trying to look at their benefits under what Startup India initiative. And I'm extremely happy that Ambassador Sandhu has taken this initiative to take all these startups and build this bridge with US-India Strategic Partnership Forum for a very comprehensive program for supporting these startups. I'm sure this is just the beginning. And the way we are formulating programs, we have substantial stuff coming for the startups during this program. We do really hope to see some of them access markets in the US and in other territories to grow and claim greater heights. My appreciation and my gratitude is due to Ambassador Sandhu and Mr. John Chambers and the US ISPF, Dr. Mukesh Aghi, for organizing this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Agarwal, for your kind remarks and expression of support. I just want to mention for the first time, I'm seeing the Embassy of India in DC taking a lead on startup initiative in the US. So I just want to compliment Ambassador Sandhu for being very innovative and entrepreneur in trying to drive this. So thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your effort. We do have, John, who is, I would say, one of the leaders in the US, not only from a large corporation perspective, but also from a startup perspective. And so I have 20 minutes of Q&A with him, and then we'll open it to the audience. And my request to the audience is, if you have a question, please post it in the chat, and I will convey that to John. John, if I may just start with you. I know French President Macron had appointed you as the ambassador. You build up a startup ecosystem in France. And France used to be a laggard in startup. It was a bureaucracy, could not build any startup companies. Today it's a leader. What are the three things France did to kickstart the economy, which became a startup economy?
Well, first, let me thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank the ambassador and the leadership of the Indian government and the Prime Minister's office for the sponsorship. And that's perhaps the first thing that France did well, is it was sponsored by President Macron. The organization then set up structures around that to become a startup nation, outlined a dream very similar to what Prime Minister Modi did in terms of a startup France, a startup India, with a vision of making it inclusive across their 13 territories, as opposed to 29 states in India. And then he became the champion again and again in driving it through, and having key elements of his administration take responsibility for helping the startups to progress. It takes a vision. The second thing that occurs is you've got to capture the imagination of the citizens, not just of the people who are going to do startups, but the benefit that startups can bring to the entire nation. And then you've got to have the courage to outline goals that somebody considers almost impossible, and then to implement those goals. And as you said, in France, they changed how their education system worked. They focused on, out of their best engineering schools, generating startups. I had the honor to lecture at a number of the schools with my government friends, whether it was President Macron himself or the Ministry of Defense. And you begin to see a nation dream what was possible, inspire hope, much like Prime Minister Modi is doing. And then you begin to execute. And in a period of 5 years, France literally moved from the worst place in Europe to create jobs and the worst place for innovation to the best. And people thought it would not happen, but they outlined the program. They had both the sense of urgency, but also the commitment to execute off of it. And so what you see is a playbook, Mr. Ambassador, similar to what you articulated earlier about Startup India, that you can implement as a country and do it at a tremendous scale. And to do it in a way that is truly inclusive across all the geographies, across all the various religious organization groups, across gender, et cetera, in a way that is inclusive. I love the 80% of the 720 districts in India already having startups and beginning to participate. So in technology terms, I think we crossed the chasm in India about this going mainline. And now the key is, how do we scale and grow? And that's exactly where France is. You focus on how many startups do you have? In India, the example of 41,000. How many of those are unicorns? 20 of them are today, or 21. How many can be in 3 years? 50. And you build the program and drive it through. So when you have government and businesses working together with a common vision, you make it inclusive regardless of political parties or geographies, and then you drive it through. That's what made France successful. And I would argue that's what is making India successful as well.
Thank you, John. Coming down to the startups itself, when you look at the startups, almost 95% fail. And fail in the sense is for multiple reasons. And the 5% succeed and 1% become unicorn. What are the fundamental differences between success and failure among startups?
Well, I think it starts with having the courage, as my colleagues mentioned earlier in their comments, to take risk, and a realization that whether it's 90% fail, excuse me, or 95% fail, knowing that if you miss, then you try again. I've looked at several of the startups on the system today. I know some of the key leaders like Vinod and AD that are on the session. You have the courage to try and to really make a difference. If you bring it down to specifics, the role of a startup is to, and it really falls on the shoulder of the founders and the CEO, is to outline a vision and strategy enabled by new technology. And it's an ability to move into a market and use technology to change a market. Every startup will, in my opinion, in the future, be a technology startup, directly or indirectly, whether you're in healthcare, government, manufacturing, defense, or technology itself. The second element is the quality of the team that founding group builds around them. And how do you outline a vision for what you're going to accomplish and how you move forward? Startups will almost without exception struggle at about 100 or 150 people, struggle again at 500, struggle again at 1,500 and 5,000. I've never understood exactly why that occurs, but it has to do with, as you scale, leadership teams often do not evolve and make the changes needed and the tough decisions needed to take their startup to the next level. And this is where I think the mentorship program that you all are putting in place is so important. And it's one of the things the Valley does famously. Just always telling war stories is something I believe in about it. When I came out here, I'd worked for IBM and Wang Laboratories. One has 200,000 people, another had 32,000. I had no idea about Silicon Valley. Yet Lou Platt at Hewlett-Packard, the original garage startup in Silicon Valley, the CEO, put me underneath his wing and mentored me for literally 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, we were way past the unicorn at Cisco at that stage. And I asked him, what could I do to pay Hewlett-Packard back? And he said, just pay it forward. Do it for the next generation, which is something I try to do. So the other thing that I think is important to startups is culture. And I believe in a culture of financial return for the investors and the founders, but also of equal importance, the benefit to society as you give back. Mistakes that the startups make. The first is you've got to be pretty confident what is your differentiation and how do you drive it through. Secondly, everybody likes to talk about growth and successes, but what determines whether a startup survives or not is how they handle the setbacks. Jack Welch, a generation in front of me, taught me very early about the importance of you never will have a great company till you have a near-death experience. Most startups in this call will have a near-death experience, and you will come out of that stronger if you do your job right and drive it through. Third is you've got to constantly reinvent yourself. It used to be an industry, you reinvented yourself in the automotive industry every 20 years. Well, and a startup enabled by technology, regardless which industry segment you're focused on, you have to reinvent yourself every 3 years. So those are kind of, Mukesh, the key elements. If you were to say, what is the role of the CEO? It's vision and strategy. Build a leadership team to implement that vision and strategy. Culture, which is much more important than people realize in the future of a startup, and then communicating the above.
Thank you. John, you talk about culture. And culture varies from geography to geography, depending on the environment. What kind of culture do you find, a corporate culture you find, which is highly successful for startup as compared to established organization?
Well, it's a combination of the questions you just asked. First is many cultures can be successful. The culture at a Microsoft is different than a culture at a Cisco, different than a culture at Oracle, different than a culture at Intel, as examples. But every one of these companies that became great companies and successful had very strong cultures. And it starts with the leadership at the top. One of the things that I focused on very early at Cisco when I made India our second world headquarters was reminding our team in India and our employee family, and it is a family in my opinion that we built, that our culture is the same regardless of where you are in the world. And somebody in the back of the audience said, well, John, no, our culture is different in India than it should be in the US or Europe. And I had fun because I had my badge and employee badge on, and I walked to the back of the room and I walked him through the culture in front of the cameras and everything rolling. I was having fun. He was kind of nervous, but I said, all right, what's different? Customer first, number one element. Same in India as the US, of course. Treat each other with respect and part of an extended family. Is it different in India versus the US? Of course not. Just do the right thing. And what I'm sharing with you is strong cultures are important that you articulate as a startup, even when you have as few as 10 or 12 people. And you can't just assume that everybody gets what the culture is. You need to just put it down on a cultural slide saying, here are the key elements. You will never have a great company without a really strong culture. Cultures will be different, but they need to be consistent on a global basis for those Indian startups that are coming to the US and for those Indian startups that are going to go globally. You need to have a central culture, and it needs to be owned by the founders.
Thank you. John, you yourself are an investor in 20 plus startups. And they are, most of them, I would say, are on a path of highly successful transition. What are the couple of traits you look at before you invest in those startups? Is it the leadership? Is it technology? Or is it management or the environment?
Okay. I always like to deal with numbers and establish the foundation. The first is I set ambitious goals for the startups that I select. I try to select a startup that has a realistic chance of being one or two, the number one or number two player in the US or globally in their product category. And out of my 20 startups that I've currently invested in, and I have an unfair advantage, I get my pick of the litter almost, whether it's in France or the US or India or anywhere in the world for which startups. And I'm not sure I deserve that, but I have an unfair advantage on who do I get to select. And my goal is out of the 20 startups for over a dozen of them to become unicorns. 3 of them are already there. Another 5 are within 2 years of getting there with a pretty good probability of doing it. And when you have a hit rate that high, it says you have a replicatable program to drive through. So what I look for is an industry that is in transition enabled by new technology. And something everybody on this call will get, it's what Amazon did using the internet to change. Instead of going to a physical location to buy books and then other products, you do it over the internet. And they wrote it to one of the most powerful companies in the world. So I look to see what is the business model change occurring, or the healthcare model, or the government model, or the defense model. And then I look for the new technology that is going to fundamentally change that. The ambassador talked earlier about AI and machine learning. It's one of the key changes going on, the Internet of Things, et cetera. So when you see a business model changing enabled by new technology, that's when I really get interested. And that's what I am doing again and again across probably 7 different verticals of the 20 companies I invest in. Then I bet on the CEO and the founders. And I bet on them with the intention that I'm not a believer as a VC. My job is to change CEOs. It's the reverse. The most successful venture capitalists will usually tell you that the companies that performed the best looking backwards were almost the ones, without exception, that the CEO they bet on was the one that they exited with 5 or 10 or 15 years later. So I really focus on the CEO. Do I think she or he has the leadership capabilities? Do they know what they know and know what they don't? Can they build a strong team? I'm also a believer in a culture of the startups that I invest in having the same values I do. Just like 180 acquisitions I did at Cisco, we would not acquire a company that didn't have the same culture or values and drive it through. Then I look at their ability to really get excited by their customers. I want to talk to one or two of their top customers, ideally one of them that have worked jointly with them on the products, see how strategic those products are to the success of the companies. And
I think we lost John. We'll try to get it back on.
John is
can
back.
you
John.
hear me okay?
Now we can hear you. Yes, John.
Okay, I had to log back in. Probably some Huawei equipment in the network that there's a problem with that I'll ask Cisco to look into. But back in summary, there is a replicatable pattern that you can do, Mukesh. And part of what I love to do is mentor and to help companies when they inevitably get into trouble, help them grow and scale and share the experiences.
Thank you. John, let me just come back to your Cisco days. You know, it was more of a startup. You took it to a world-class company. And in process, you acquired, I would say, the only CEO I know who's acquired over 170 plus companies from a technology perspective and merged them. And when you look at acquiring those companies, what was a couple of things you looked at before you acquired them and merged them into Cisco?
Well, they're similar to the concepts that I focused on in my startup selections. I am a believer in getting a playbook that you operate on as a business leader, as an investor. And so I knew in doing acquisitions in the early 90s, almost all technology acquisitions failed. And usually when a company did an acquisition, their stock went down. So I knew we would not be smarter than others. We would have to do it different. And so we developed a playbook based upon why companies failed in their acquisition process that we then ran. And to your point, out of the 180 that we did, 2/3 of which exceeded what we told our board of directors we would accomplish in acquisitions. The rules were fairly simple. It goes back to understand what you're acquiring and protect it at all costs. When a bank buys another bank, they're buying geography and customers. When Nations Bank bought Bank of America as an example. When you buy a technology company, and remember every company, regardless of industry, of the startups we have in India will become technology companies as well as a distribution company or a manufacturing company or a government company. And so I would look, can I keep the people? And I'm really buying next generation product. And the way that you can determine if you can keep the people, how similar is the culture, where are the founders, what motivates them? When you acquire a company, usually the attrition rate of the acquired company, once the golden handcuffs come off, is 20 to 25% a year. My attrition rate of my acquired companies was 4% over 20 years. And so I worked very hard with, is there a vision and a similarity of culture? Then I wanted to make sure there was a clear understanding between the company being acquired and Cisco about what roles would each one play and report them higher into the organization to make sure that occurs. And then you had to provide them cover. because the large company can either kill them with too much attention or ignore them in the process. And for me, we did that not just 180 times, we did it in moving from routing to switching to the data center to security to wireless to computing at the edge, et cetera. And we would use acquisitions as a way to move into new markets. Now, let me bring it back to the audience. It's surprising how often the startups are now starting to acquire even at an earlier stage. So as you do a startup, and it's something USISPF could do, maybe just develop a quick playbook for doing acquisitions. And on the acquisitions, you want to make sure the cultures are similar. You want it to be, in my opinion, customer driven. Your customers, whether they're consumer or business, should tell you what to do. You want to make sure you're going to be able to hold the team and get the next generation out. Geographic proximity is a key advantage, although becoming less and less important in terms of the direction. And then articulating what the success looks like 3 years after the acquisition, almost writing the press release, both for the acquired companies and for the acquiring companies, and then sticking to that press release in terms of executing through it. So it's an art, but it's one that I'm seeing my startups, and 2 of them out of India, interestingly enough, are already doing acquisitions, even though they're only up to, a little bit over 100 or 200 people in the companies respectively. So doing acquisitions is something that I think startups need to think about. In terms of your exit strategy, probably only about 10% of you will exit with an IPO. 80 to 90% will exit with being acquired by somebody, for those that are successful as well.
Thank you, John. John, you have a uncanny sixth sense of jumping the trend. You can forecast, and that's how you grew Cisco. When you look at the shift in trends in technology, usage, environment, what do you look for so you're able to move way ahead of the competition, way ahead of the curve itself?
Well, I think in part the answer is the way you stated your question. I never believed in competing against competitors. If you're focusing on a competitor, you can do a lookalike out of the US, an Amazon lookalike or a Uber lookalike, et cetera. But most of the time, those real successful companies will get a market transition that is occurring and then ride the transition to a leadership role. And so I would always focus on what is the market transition occurring. And I'd listen to my customers and listen to people that are knowledgeable in the market. And then when I see that transition occurring, that's when I bet very aggressively. So examples that I think your audience could appreciate. The hottest area in artificial intelligence and machine learning right now is the customer experience call centers, but it will go across the whole companies. So when I see a company like a Unifor that was founded in India and growing very well with a brilliant young CEO, but a great founding team together, I see the capability of a market transition changing, enabled by new technology, a CEO that I think is really good with a great team around him that customers loved. And then I look at how do I help them grow and scale and navigate through the tough times, et cetera, and develop a unique mentoring coach process in terms of the direction. So I focus on getting the market transitions right. And I do that by listening to customers. Then I play it back to customers and say, here's what I'm seeing. Do you see this? And then you identify the early movers and shakers in customers that are willing to take the risk. A startup India, a startup France, and a startup Israel are the top 3 startup nations, in my opinion, in the world in terms of scaling with a program really to drive it through. And so you've got to locate the leaders, whether it's in government or businesses, that will literally foster this type of environment with a crisp understanding of the goal and the courage to change things. Everybody says they want change, except when it affects them. And if you're going to really do startups well, you have to have courage to constantly change. And often the hardest person to change in a startup is the CEO themselves, to change him or her in terms of how they transition as you get to be 100 people, 500 people, 1,500 people, 5,000, and how does the leader evolve as you occur on it? Common mistakes people make in that environment is they stay with the entire team too long. There are going to be some people that can scale with you and some people that can't. I'm a huge believer in family within the company. That's not necessarily something that every startup needs to have at all, but I do believe in it. So it's hard to change one of your family members when suddenly they can't scale. But yet, if you don't evolve your team as you move forward and move that family member to a role that they can do and not necessarily be the head of engineering anymore or the head of sales anymore, that's the mistake that often startups make, is they as they evolve, they don't evolve their leadership team as well.
John, you have unicorns in India and others who are looking at US market to enter. And they're looking for mentors, they're looking for platforms, they're looking for, around, Series C, D funding itself. What would be your advice to them? Should they come to the US market because it's highly competitive, or they just go to other geographies itself?
Well, my advice would be the following. First is you do want to find mentors. One of my major worries about France and India early on is, even though both India and France had very large, big corporate conglomerates, they did not have a startup community that you could get mentors from and learn from their lessons and learn how to share that. Now, the cool thing is with technologies like Zoom and Google Meets and Microsoft capability and Cisco capability, you can suddenly mentor in a very unique way. The first element when you begin to think about moving outside of India is, have you really got your product solid? Are you really ready to compete on a global scale? And the best way to find that out is really to take your product and part of your leadership team to the US. It's a much more competitive environment, but it also, if you address the segment of the market, which is not just 25% of the world's GDP, it's probably 50% of the world's early acceptance of startup technologies on a competitive scale, then you know if you're ready to go global. So the first thing I would try to do if I were a startup is be successful in India. And then if I really felt the product was differentiated enough and it was solid enough, I would then bring it to the US. And this is where I think USI and India Strategic Partnership Forum can play a role. And I think you all are playing a very aggressive role. How do you uniquely able that transition between the US and India, I think the two most strategic partnership countries in the world, to make that happen smoother? Now, interestingly enough, and I did this in preparation for today's meeting, out of my 20 startups, over 50% of them have first or second generation India diaspora in their founders. And so I think the culture of Indian startups being successful in the US and people immigrating to the US is one that works well and I focus on as well. But what is fascinating, to the ambassador's comments, I found that the top startups in the US are now using India as their second location, not just for engineering, but for talent and culture as well. And I'm seeing the top startups in India view the US as their second location in terms of job creation, et cetera. And this is where I think the ties between our two nations can increase dramatically. I think it is the most strategic partnership in the world, and I think it has huge advantage for the startups that are on this call together.
Thank you, John. I know we have 10 minutes left, and I have a lot of Q&A coming in. So let me ask you, Silicon Valley's success is it built a very strong ecosystem. Yes. And one of the principles was that the company has to be within 20 minutes drive of the investors so they can go meet, mentor, do whatever we need to. In the current COVID situation, that rule seems to have shifted. And if it has shifted, how it has shifted and what's the impact you see?
All right, I'll try to move into a lightning round with my questions. I'll answer them in a tighter format. I think the trend was already starting to occur, Mukesh, where people were learning through new technologies and the general public acceptance of those new technologies, that you could locate your employees almost anywhere in the world and that you could locate your investments almost anywhere in the world. There will still be the probability of the closer the VC is to their startups, the higher the success. But it used to be the rule of thumb was your success rate dropped by 20 or 30% the minute you got on an airplane and dropped by 50% the minute you had to leave a country. That is changing very rapidly. And the new technologies, I think, contribute to that, but also the terrible challenges that COVID presented to us, both for people's lives and loss of lives, forced us to do business in a different way. And I don't think it will ever go back. So I think you're beginning to open up to where your employees could be across all 29 states in India, and the companies you acquire can be across multiple countries as well. It adds a degree of complexity, but what COVID forced us to do, it forced us to innovate at a tremendous speed. No one thought we could do a vaccine in less than 5 years, and we did it in less than a year. That speed of innovation is rolling through the startups remarkably quick, and there's a huge supply of money. And I know it's often difficult to raise, especially the Series B and C money in India, but there's a huge supply of money, the likes of which I've never seen in my career, that is behind the capability to move fast and to fund these new concepts and ventures and opportunities together.
Thank you, John. Question, if you have to offer 3 suggestions to CEOs as the founding principles to take organization to next level, what they would be?
Compete, what I said earlier, against market transitions, not companies. Build a great team with a very, very strong culture, and be customer driven. Those would be the 3 founding principles that I would focus on.
Thank you. Another question, the startup leaders are caught between is board of directors' vision and investors' vision. How do you balance that between the VC community and the board of directors community?
Well, this is a tricky one. It's what I enjoy kind of coaching the startups about their board and their investors. The vision and the strategy has to be done by the CEO and his or her team. And if the investors think their job is to do strategy for the company, they shouldn't have been investing in the company in the first place. Their job is to help on that. Secondly, as the companies become successful, you'll see their boards evolve from largely venture capital boards to more people who've been there and done it before. And that's where getting people on your board relatively early who have done other startups, who have experienced the growth or have the financial background or the go-to-market background that can help people evolve. But the board is there to advise and to help on the strategy and to do the investments of the startups, not to run the company. And that role should not get confused in terms of the approach. I feel very strongly about that, as you can tell.
Thanks. Question from James Joseph. John, could you share some insight based on your experience of acquiring Flip video camera? Can startup negotiate a return of IP in case the partner decides to exit the business due to strategic reasons?
Well, it's 3 things. First, let me be very upfront. Flip was an acquisition that I used very aggressively to move into the video market at the home. I already had the set-top boxes technology-wise. I already had the global service providers using our routers and switches to move video around. And I believe that home generation of content would be a logical move into the consumer. The concept may have been right, as Apple showed with their capability. And Steve Jobs brought out the technology, held our Flip camera up on stage after I acquired them for $600 million and said, "This is a great product." And my team said, "See?" And I said, "Watch what comes next." He said, "I'm going to give it to you for free." He outmaneuvered me. And once he did, we were beaten. And so I closed the $600 million acquisition. And it is the one acquisition that people talk about even today about the one that I missed. It wasn't in my top 20 in terms of size of acquisitions, but yet it was one that I missed, and I had the courage to actually change quickly. So I have no regrets about taking the risk, but once I saw it wasn't going to make it, you have to have the courage to close it. The technology at that time would not have continued, in my opinion, at a successful rate. We looked at selling that or allowing the founders to run with it as an option. It was not an option. That same year, we did a $3.2 billion acquisition that was very successful and a $2.1 billion acquisition that was very successful. No one ever talks about the successful ones. And that's just part of leadership. And when you take risks, you're going to be criticized, and you got to listen to the criticism for the ones that don't work out. But I reminded everyone that I said at least 1 out of 3 is going to fail in a market where 9 out of 10 fail. Our track record was pretty good on it. But Flip was one that I missed on. I have no regrets of trying it. I tried to move into the consumer market 3 times. I missed all 3 times. So that's why you see my expertise largely in the government and business markets, both enterprise and commercial.
John, question from Sunil Mehta. You mentioned about Indian startups should target to succeed in India, then move to the US market. In the case of value proposition being very relevant in the US market as well, should we worry about being late in the US market while working on succeeding in Indian market?
The answer would have been yes if you were business to business 5 years ago. The Indian startup market, as you look at your 41,000 startups, majority of them are focused on the consumer. And when you have 1.3 billion consumers, that's kind of an exciting place to be. And so as a consumer market, going strength in India and then to the US is, I think, a natural. On the business to business market, you normally had to come to the US earlier. The Indian large companies did not usually embrace startups like the US large companies do automatically. And so very often, once you got a good product and got it working, you had to go earlier to the US to really get customers who would help you develop the products and to take the business risk for you. That's more of a nature of the US enterprise market than it is of the Indian market. And the same was true in France, by the way. However, that's starting to change. I now see the enterprise companies in India, whether it's the large banks, whether it's the consultancy groups, et cetera, starting to interface to startups in a different way. So I believe today it is the right way to do it. Get it going first in India, then move rapidly to the US, then go global would be my standard playbook. That doesn't mean that you can't expand out of India to Southeast Asia, get strong, and then move to the US or to Europe. But my two-step would be India first, then US second for a company that really wants to try to play on a global scale.
John, I have a lot of questions, but I'm out of time also. One final question.
Okay.
You built a large global organization, Cisco, hugely successful. And now you have kind of transitioned to startup. A big major difference from a large, I would say, I wouldn't say bureaucratic, but a large organization to an organization which has 3 people and running almost 20 different startups.
Yes.
What motivates you to drive that? What excites you to drive that? And where do you keep on getting the energy to make that successful?
So the sequence you raised it, I'm having more fun in my business life than I ever have. It's like having a large family that you're kind of the guiding light, perhaps, to helping them being successful. And your joy is them becoming successful. Many times people out of large companies can adjust to a startup environment, either as an investor or as a member of the team, or as a mentor, because they are used to that bureaucracy. And I think that's a fair word. When you're a small startup, you can't afford bureaucracy, and it's got to be lean. It's got to move rapidly. I love making a difference. My definition of success is when the CEO and his or her team is successful, and I focus on job creation being my end goal. And if you get great job creation growing at 50% or 100% per year, by definition, you are growing your orders at a rate probably 20 to 50% higher than your job creation engine. I love what I do. I get to pick my startups. I pick them on culture as much as I do on the business model change. If I don't believe they have a culture that I believe in terms of how they treat their employees, how they give back to society as well as be successful as a company, how they make it a win-win with the investors, et cetera, I just don't invest in it. But I've never had more fun. On the energy side, I don't know exactly what caused it. Most of the time it's an advantage, but I have almost endless energy. I enjoy what I do. I wake up each morning with my pupils dilated, ready to go. I do 8 to 15 video sessions a day on the days that I'm working a normal pace on. And it's a joy to watch these companies be successful. But the last comment is, I had a chance to help change the world one time with the internet at Cisco. That is so exciting. We created 10,000 millionaires among our employees. We were the #1 company in almost every category on corporate social responsibility. And we were #1 in terms of customer satisfaction. I would like to do that one more time with the startup community, to where if you believe, as you said, Mukesh, in your opening comments, almost all job creation will come from these startups. And if you're going to have an inclusive society as opposed to a huge digital divide in your society, getting startups across all the states, the geographies, across the various backgrounds and genders of the citizens become key. And to do that is a rush and a joy. So I'm trying to change the world one more time. I'm a dreamer. I believe dreams only come true when you have a plan to get there and a playbook to operate, and then you're willing to share that playbook. I hope today has been useful for the people on the session. If you agree with everything I've said, I have failed. I want to get you outside your comfort zone on the areas you focus in on. And again, I really want to challenge India to become not just a startup nation, but the #1 startup nation in the world. That is within your grasp. You're the largest democracy. Your IITs are amazing. Your prime minister and the leadership team that he has put around him, I think, have the capability to really establish that foundation for the next, not 5 or 10 years, but for the next 25. I would challenge the country and the startups in this call to dream and then make these dreams come true.
John, thank you very much for the insight and your feedback. We appreciate it and we feel honored you took the time. I just want to say thank you to Shri Anil Agarwal and Ambassador Sandhu for taking the leadership, because I strongly believe that US-India relationship will get much more cemented on startup scene by creating investments and jobs between the two nations. So thank you once again for taking the time. Over to you, Dipti, for the break, and we go from there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.